Kayla sat at the window of her small kitchen looking out at the fall sunset. The colors of the sky played in pink and orange hues, but their beauty didn't bring her joy. She had long ago stopped noticing such details. The cup of tea she held in her hands was already cold. How many times had she sat like this, staring at the emptiness, trying to figure out how her and Russell's marriage had come to this? Her husband, Russell, was a successful builder, a man of strong character who used to mesmerize her with his confidence and ambition. But over the past few years, things had changed. Their conversations had become short and empty, as if they were talking to each other just to avoid silence. He'd come home late from work, absorbed in his own affairs, and every time she tried to find out what was bothering him, he'd only wave off, "It's okay." But Kayla knew it wasn't. They had been married for 8 years. Kayla used to believe that love could conquer anything, even hard times. But now it seemed to her that there was an invisible wall between them that she couldn't break down. Every night when Russell returned home, she asked herself the same question. Did they still have love? Or was it just habit that kept them together? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door. Russell had returned. He walked past with a quick hi and went straight upstairs. Kayla sighed, setting her cup on the table, and stood up. She didn't try to talk to him again tonight. It was useless. Their dinners were silent now, filled with a heavy sense of alienation. That evening, Kayla decided to leave the house. She needed to clear her head. She put on a warm jacket and went for a walk through the quiet streets of their neighborhood. Everyone knew each other here, and she was often stopped for short conversations. But today she walked quickly, avoiding the glances of familiar faces. She was heading toward Mary and Michael's house. Mary, her cousin, had always been a role model. Successful, beautiful, confident. Mary lived a life that Kayla could only dream of. They were always close despite their different personalities. As a child, Mary was the one they turned to for advice, and that hasn't changed even now that they're both adults. Mary married Michael when she was 25. Everything seemed perfect with them. A beautiful home, Mary's brilliant career in advertising, and Michael, who was always attentive to her. But today, Kayla wasn't going for advice. She just wanted to feel better by spending time with those whose lives seemed so serene. When she reached the Jenkins house, the doors were already open. Mary stood on the doorstep, smiling welcomingly as always. "Kayla, it's so good to see you." Mary looked flawless in her white sweater and jeans. She hugged her like there was no problem in the world. "I just thought I'd go for a walk," Kayla replied, embarrassed, feeling her tiredness and gloomy thoughts slowly dissipate. "Come on in. Michael and I were just thinking of having a quiet evening at home," Mary invited, gesturing to the cozy living room. "He's upstairs finishing up some work." Kayla stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the fireplace spilling pleasantly into the room. The Jenkins house had always been like this, cozy and inviting. Mary and Michael knew how to create the family atmosphere that Kayla had missed in her own home. A few minutes later, Michael came down into the living room, holding a glass of wine. He was just as charming as Kayla remembered him. Tall, slender, with a soft smile that always made her feel comfortable in his presence. "Kayla, it's been a long time." Michael smiled, taking a seat next to her. "How's life?" "Oh, you know, the usual," she answered evasively, trying not to look him directly in the eye. But Michael was too attentive not to notice her confusion. He was always good at picking up on things like that. Their conversation gradually turned to more personal topics, and Kayla suddenly began to open up to him. They talked about her marriage to Russell, how she felt trapped in a cage, how she didn't know how to get out of it. Michael listened to her intently, without interrupting, and it was such a relief to finally be heard. That night, something changed between them. Kayla noticed Michael looking at her with an understanding and sympathy that she hadn't gotten from Russell in years. For a moment, she felt a special bond forming between them. It was more than just friendship. As Kayla drove home late at night, her heart beat faster than usual. She thought about Michael. It was wrong, she knew that. But at the same time, it felt so natural. His attention, his concern. It was exactly what she'd been missing. It had been several weeks since the evening Kayla had visited Mary and Michael's house. What had seemed like a simple dinner with friends at the time had quickly turned into something more. Michael found himself around more and more often, as if fate itself was pushing them closer together. He called her, wrote to her, inquired about her affairs. His concern was so genuine that Kayla couldn't resist. She knew it was wrong. Every time Michael texted her, her heart beat faster, but at the same time, she felt an oppressive sense of guilt. She lied to herself, claiming it was just an innocent friendship, that Michael was just trying to help her through a difficult time. But the more time they spent together, the stronger their attraction became. Kayla tried to keep herself in check, but every conversation they had, every chance encounter, only deepened the chasm between her and Russell. Her husband was staying late at work more and more often, and they hardly spoke at home. In the evenings, he sat in his chair with his laptop, staring at business reports and construction plans. Sometimes he spent time in the garage, where he liked to do minor repairs. It was his refuge from the world. Kayla no longer tried to pull him out of that shell. One morning, as she was getting ready for work, her phone vibrated with a new message. It was Michael. "Hey Kayla, why don't we have lunch together today? There's something I want to talk about." Kayla stared at the screen for a long time, wondering what she should do. She knew she should say no, but she couldn't find the strength to say no. After a few seconds of hesitation, she typed back, "Sure, where should we meet?" Michael chose a small restaurant outside of town, a quiet place where no one knew them. When Kayla arrived, he was already waiting for her at a table by the window. He had a glass of water in his hands, and his gaze slid down the walls as if he were trying to hide his anxiety. Kayla noticed that he looked tired and somewhat tense. "Hi," she said quietly, taking a seat across from him. "Is something wrong?" Michael exhaled and smiled slightly, his tension dissipating a little. "No, nothing's wrong. Just wanted to talk. It's always easier with you." That simple compliment warmed her from the inside out. Kayla knew that Michael was being sincere. Unlike Russell, who had long since stopped showing interest in her, Michael was attentive and caring. "You know," Michael continued, a little pensive, "I've been trying to figure out what's going on in my life for a while now. Everything seems to be going according to plan, but sometimes I feel like I'm stuck in one place. And Mary, it's like she lives in her own world where there's no room for me." Kayla nodded, understanding his feelings. She was experiencing the same thing with Russell. They talked for over an hour, discussing their failures, their dreams, their hopes. Their coming together had become inevitable. Michael was the man Kayla had been looking for so long, someone who understood her, who saw her for who she really was. Gradually, their conversations became more and more frank. They talked about their families, problems in their marriages, hidden desires that neither of their spouses could understand. Michael was the only person Kayla could confide in. He was her anchor in the turbulent ocean of life. That dinner had started a new phase of their relationship. Now they were not only texting, but meeting in secret. It became their little secret, which was becoming more dangerous by the day. Their connection was growing deeper, and Kayla realized it wasn't just a fling. Mary, meanwhile, suspected nothing. She was too consumed with her career to notice the change in Michael's behavior. Her job at the advertising agency demanded more and more of her time, and she and Michael spent fewer and fewer evenings together. In Mary's eyes, their marriage was quite successful, and she couldn't imagine anything strange happening. Mary had always considered herself an intelligent and perceptive woman. She was used to being the center of attention and in control of her life down to the smallest detail. That was why it had never occurred to her that Michael might be cheating. In her world, it was simply impossible. Russell had no idea what was going on behind his back either. He was too busy with his own problems. His construction business was going under. Every day the clients were getting more dissatisfied and the costs were getting higher. Russell tried to keep things under control, but his anxiety was growing like a snowball. He had to borrow money from people he'd rather not do business with. It was all weighing on him, but he didn't want to talk to Kayla about it. He felt he had to solve his problems on his own. Pride and fear of appearing weak kept him silent. Russell was confident that he could handle it, even though the fear of failure had long since settled inside him. Meanwhile, Kayla and Michael's relationship continued to grow. They met more and more often, hiding from prying eyes. They enjoyed every moment they spent together. as if they knew it couldn't last forever. One day, they met in a park far from the city. Sitting on a bench, Kayla looked out over the lake while Michael quietly told her how tired he was of life with Mary. He could no longer pretend that everything was okay. His words resonated with Kayla because she felt the same way about Russell. "Kayla," Michael said suddenly, turning to her, "I can't live like this anymore. I don't want to lie anymore. I want to be with you. Do you understand that?" She looked at him and felt her heart sink. Those words were something she had been waiting for so long, but they also scared her. Michael was married and so was she. Their relationship could ruin everything they had. "Michael," she said quietly, trying to find the right words, "it's not that simple. We have families, responsibilities. What's going to happen to Mary? What's going to happen to Russell?" Michael took her hand, his eyes full of determination. "We'll find a way out. We deserve to be happy. And I'm sure we can build a new life if we take this step." Kayla didn't know what to say. She was confused. On one side of the scale were her feelings for Michael. On the other, her fear of the consequences. But one thing was certain. This moment would change everything. Meanwhile, back at Russell's house, things were only getting worse. His financial problems were mounting, and the threat of bankruptcy was real. He realized that if his secrets came out, his world would come crashing down. Russell knew that if he lost the business, he would lose Kayla as well. The thought was tearing him up inside. One night, after coming home late, Russell found Kayla gone. He looked around, noticing her cell phone on the table. That was odd. Kayla never left her phone unattended. He picked it up and saw a new message from Michael. "When will I see you?" Russell felt something shiver in his chest. He couldn't believe his eyes. Michael, his friend, Mary's husband, texting his wife? Jealousy and anger came over him like a wave, but he restrained himself. He needed more proof. The secret affair between Kayla and Michael was reaching its peak. Every glance, every stolen minute together seemed more and more forbidden, and thus even more desirable. Their encounters grew brighter but also more dangerous. They realized they were walking on the edge of a precipice. Lately, Kayla had been feeling a growing uneasiness. At first, it was just a fleeting sensation, but as time went on, it intensified. She couldn't shake the thought that this was all going to end badly. The secret meetings were becoming more and more difficult to plan. The dexterity with which they deceived those around them didn't seem as flawless as before. She realized things were only going to get worse ahead. Michael, for his part, was becoming increasingly nervous. Mary asked him more and more questions that he couldn't ignore. She began to notice his frequent absences, phone calls, and constant distractions. At first, Michael dismissed her suspicions as the result of her natural jealousy, but he soon realized that Mary did suspect something. She was no longer content with empty promises. That week, as the passion reached its climax, Mary became more active. She didn't just ask questions anymore. She began to openly spy on him, to see who he was texting and when, and even tried to access his phone, which irritated Michael even more. But the worst part for him was that he realized that sooner or later her suspicions would turn into certainties. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Mary blurted out one evening when Michael came home from work. She was standing at the stove, not taking her eyes off him. Michael looked at her. His heart pounded faster. What does she know? What are you talking about? He tried to remain calm. Mary threw the towel on the table and stepped closer to him. "About you disappearing all the time. About you being different. Tell me the truth, Michael. Are you seeing someone else?" He looked away and quickly changed the subject, avoiding answering. But Mary kept up. Her eyes glittered with anger, and the tension in the room grew by the minute. "You're not leaving until you tell me the truth," she persisted, blocking his path to the exit. Michael felt the walls shrinking around him. He realized that if he continued to lie, the situation would only get worse. But he couldn't tell Mary the truth. He was too afraid of her reaction, and there was too much at stake. "Mary, you're just getting yourself worked up. There's no one. I'm just tired. Work is exhausting, you know." She squinted at me, a look of disbelief in her eyes. "Tired, you say? Is that your new excuse? You think I don't notice the way you look at your phone every 5 minutes? How you hide it from me? I'm not stupid, Michael." He couldn't find anything to say. Mary stopped talking and just walked out of the room, slamming the door loudly. Despair was growing inside him, but he couldn't let himself show it. He knew he had to be more careful if he didn't want to lose everything. Meanwhile, Kayla could feel the situation becoming unbearable for her as well. Michael was constantly on edge. Their conversations had become short and stretched like a string. She was overwhelmed with guilt for causing his problems with Mary, but at the same time, she couldn't stop the relationship. She couldn't give up on him even though she realized it was wrong. Once they met at the hotel, Kayla exhaled and looked at Michael, who was sitting across from her with a grim face. "We can't go on like this," she said, breaking the silence. He glared at her. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about us, Michael. We can't live in constant fear. It's exhausting. Mary suspects something, doesn't she?" Michael hesitated. "Yes," he finally admitted. "She's tried to check my phone more than once, watching my every move. It's getting harder and harder for me to fool her." Kayla felt her heart clench. "Then why do we keep going? You and I have gone too far. Sooner or later it's going to end badly." He lowered his head and ran his hand over his face, as if trying to remove thoughts of what might happen. Michael didn't know how to answer her question. Every time they met, he felt alive, but every day their relationship became more and more risky. Eventually, he himself began to fear for his own safety, and what would happen if Mary really did realize who he was cheating with. An evening came that promised to be pivotal in their relationship. Mary, trying to drown out her anxiety, gave the house a general cleaning. She no longer knew how to distract herself from thoughts of Michael. She opened the closet in their bedroom and found Michael's cell phone, which he had forgotten in the morning. She hesitated for a moment, but then resolutely picked it up. Unlocking the screen, Mary began to look through the messages. Her heart clenched in her chest. She saw the name K in the list of recent contacts. Intuitively, Mary realized this wasn't just a friend. She opened the chat room. The words she read came over her like an icy shower. Gentle messages, hidden innuendos, phrases that were impossible to misunderstand. Mary stood in utter shock, holding the phone with trembling hands. Who was this Kay? She knew she had to find out. Her anger was growing by the minute. That same evening, Kayla, returning home from an outing with her daughters, noticed something was wrong in her house. When she opened the door, it seemed to her that it was unlocked, even though she distinctly remembered locking it in the morning. Kayla looked around the house but didn't see anything strange. Still, the feeling of unease never left her. On the kitchen table, she noticed a key that didn't belong to her. It was a keychain with the logo of the construction company Michael worked for. Why were his keys here? Michael never left anything at her house. Kayla took the keys in her hands and a chill ran down her spine. Something didn't feel right. It was as if someone was watching her. Neither Mary nor Kayla knew that their secret life had begun to fall apart. The events they were both trying to hide were slowly but surely coming to their explosive finale. The day started out as usual for Michael. He left for work early, trying not to wake Mary, who was still asleep, tired after a sleepless night. His thoughts were in turmoil. Mary's pressure, her constant suspicions, and anxious talk about the future of their marriage worried him more and more. Lately, he'd been seeking solace more and more often in the company of Kayla. It gave him a brief respite, but the problems didn't go away. They just kept piling up. Meanwhile, Mary couldn't settle down either. Her suspicions grew stronger by the day, and though she had no proof of the affair, her intuition was not failing her. Michael had become strange, aloof, nervous. Last night she had tried to look at his phone again, but he had long since begun to set complex passwords, and any attempt to get at his secrets had failed. Mary put the phone away and went to bed, deciding to talk to him the next morning. But the conversation never happened. When Michael left for work, Mary was left home alone. She had an uneasy feeling. There was a kind of oppressive silence in the house, as if the air had grown heavier. She went into the kitchen and made herself some coffee, but barely touched the cup when something made her freeze. The door to the terrace was ajar. Remembering that she had definitely locked it at night, Mary frowned. She went to the door and looked around cautiously, but saw nothing suspicious. Back in the living room, she sank down on the couch, wrapping her arms tightly around the mug, trying to shake off the growing feeling of unease. She sighed and closed her eyes, deciding to get some rest. This was the last moment Mary was alive. A few hours later, Mary's neighbor, Mrs. Lewis, who lived across the street, noticed that the door of the Fords' house was slightly ajar. It seemed strange to her, especially since Mary always locked her doors when she was alone. Mrs. Jenkins was an old-school woman, not overly nosy, but attentive enough to details not to let something like this go unnoticed. She approached the house and knocked gently on the door. There was no answer. Feeling a growing uneasiness, Mrs. Jenkins looked inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. Her gaze stopped on Mary, who was sitting on the sofa in the living room. At first it seemed as if she were asleep, but as she looked closer, Mrs. Jenkins noticed that her head was tilted in an unnatural pose, and there were strange marks on her neck. Mrs. Jenkins gasped in horror, and with trembling hands pulled out her phone. She called the police, trying to cope with the shock. By the time the police arrived, the house was already filled with the sound of sirens and commotion. Mary's face was dead pale, and her body was clearly showing signs of violent death. When Michael found out what had happened, he was at work. He received a call from the police asking him to come home immediately. At that moment, his heart sank. The news was so unexpected and frightening that he almost dropped the phone. The whole way back seemed endless to him, as if time had stopped. When he arrived at the house, there was already a crowd there. Neighbors, police, reporters. Michael stopped in front of the yellow tape that cordoned off the scene, his hands shaking and his thoughts jumbled. A policeman, noticing him, motioned him over to a detective who was already on the case. It was Detective Angela Clark, an experienced, cold-blooded, and attentive woman who specialized in such crimes. She looked at Michael with a cold, business-like manner, but her gaze immediately noted his distressed state. He couldn't look away from the house where yesterday he had hugged Mary, but now she was gone. "Are you Michael Ford?" she asked calmly, but with clear professionalism. "Yes," he mumbled, swallowing hard. "What's wrong? Is it true?" Mary. Angela didn't answer right away. She knew that in cases like this, hasty answers could prove devastating to all parties, but Michael didn't have to wait long for confirmation. "Your wife has been found dead," she said, keeping her eyes on his face, studying every emotion. Michael closed his eyes and stepped back, taking a deep breath. Pain pierced his heart, but with it came fear. Not only fear of loss, but also dread that their secret affair with Kayla might come to light. At this point, he didn't know what would happen next or how he would live if the police started digging into their relationship. Kayla, upon learning of Mary's death, was as shocked as Michael. Her first reaction was complete confusion. How could this have happened? She remembered their last meeting with Michael, the passion that still lived in her body, and panic overwhelmed her. She realized that this put not only her personal life at risk, but her reputation as well. Her secret could now come out. Meanwhile, Detective Clark began her investigation. The first step was a thorough examination of the crime scene. There was no sign of forced entry. The door was ajar, but there were no fingerprints. Everything indicated that the killer was familiar with Mary, or at least knew how to get into the house. Angela took a few pictures, checked all the surveillance tapes in the neighborhood. Nothing suspicious so far. The next step was the interrogations. She started with the neighbors to see who might have seen anything unusual that day. Mrs. Jenkins talked about how she had discovered the body, but hadn't seen any suspicious persons near the house. Angela soon moved on to Michael. His condition gave her contradictory feelings. On the one hand, he looked depressed and grief-stricken. On the other hand, his nervousness and a certain detachment made her wonder. "Where were you this morning?" she asked the key question when it was time for the interrogation. "Yeah, I was at work," Michael said, trying to control himself. "I left while Mary was still asleep. I didn't know anything until I got the call." Angela noted this alibi but decided to check all the facts before jumping to conclusions. Michael was her first suspect, but his alibi was not yet in doubt. Kayla wasn't left out of the loop either. Her ties to Michael were not known to the police, but her strange behavior, nervousness, unwillingness to discuss recent events, alerted the detective. Angela began to gradually unravel the tangle of complex relationships, suspecting that between these people lurked something more than just grief from loss. They all had their own secrets, and the killer was undoubtedly among them. The investigation into Mary's murder continued, and the atmosphere grew hotter by the day. Angela Clark, experienced and methodical, gradually began to unravel the tangle of complex relationships between Michael, Kayla, and Mary. All her intuitive hunches and assumptions were confirmed by the facts. Kayla and Michael were definitely hiding something. However, mere suspicion was not enough. Angela knew she needed hard evidence to solve the case. An additional forensic team was brought into the investigation and quickly began analyzing phone records, messages, and call history. What first alerted them were the messages that Michael and Kayla had exchanged in the weeks before the murder. Although they seemed normal at first glance, their tone became increasingly tense. Michael increasingly expressed concern and fear about his relationship with Kayla and the possible repercussions of their affair. Kayla, on the other hand, wrote about her concern that Mary might already know something. Angela studied this correspondence with particular attention. She could see how Michael's fear had gradually turned into paranoia. His messages were full of anxiety and despair. He was afraid of exposure, but not just from Mary. Guilt and fear for his career pressed down on him with each new line. Kayla, for her part, tried to reassure him, but her own fears were becoming more and more apparent. The main intrigue, however, lay not in their correspondence, but in what was revealed when Mary's phone calls were examined. On the day of the murder, Mary had not only called her lawyer, as previously assumed. The last call made shortly before her death was not to any of her close friends or relatives. It was a call to the police that had been disconnected before the operator could answer. This discovery led Angela to believe that Mary might have known her life was in danger. Further inspection revealed that Mary not only suspected Michael was cheating, but was preparing to file for divorce. Angela speculated that this may have been the trigger for the murder. But another interesting detail soon came to light. Someone had deleted some of the messages from Mary's phone, and that someone was clearly well-versed in her technology. Angela began to dig deeper, requesting data from neighbors, colleagues, and anyone else who could shed any light on the situation. She turned to Dr. Russell, Kayla's husband, who at first glance seemed like an outsider. However, after another conversation with him, something struck her as odd. His words didn't add up to the facts. Russell said that he didn't know about his wife's affair with Michael, but his behavior said otherwise. He was overly calm, and his testimony differed from what other witnesses said. For example, he claimed that he had finished his night duty at the clinic on the morning of the murder, but analysis of the CCTV cameras showed that he had left the clinic for several hours. Angela decided to follow up on this lead, despite the lack of clear evidence linking him to the crime. Meanwhile, the forensic team discovered footprints that could help solve the case. The shoes left at the crime scene were a size that didn't fit either Michael or Kayla. But most interestingly, the shoe tracks were found near a door that had been left ajar on that ill-fated day. It was these footprints that led Angela to re-interview Russell. She checked his alibi. It turned out that he was indeed absent from the clinic in the hours when the murder took place. His absence coincided with the estimated time of Mary's death. As the detective confronted him with these facts, Russell began to get nervous. His composure began to crumble under the pressure of the evidence. Angela put forward the theory that he knew about his wife and Michael's affair, and this came as a real blow to him. Russell tried to save his marriage, his reputation, but one day he discovered evidence of the affair. He was determined to get revenge. Eventually, the truth came out. Russell confessed that he had been watching Michael and Mary's house that night. He overheard their conversations, saw Michael leave for work, and realized that Mary was alone. His plan was simple: break into the house and force Mary to back off by threatening her with revealing all the dirty secrets. But something went wrong. Mary, seeing him in the house, became frightened and tried to resist. Their argument quickly spiraled out of control, and in a fit of rage, Russell strangled her. Afterward, he tried to erase all traces of his presence. He deleted messages from her phone, left the door ajar to make it appear that someone else had entered the house. Russell thought he had planned everything carefully, but he missed a few important details that led to his exposure. Angela apprehended him later that day. It was a shock to everyone. No one could have guessed that Russell, the man who had always been in the background of this tragedy, would turn out to be the killer. Michael and Kayla were just as shocked. Their secret romance had come out, but now they were forced to live with the realization that their love had been the catalyst for the chain of events that led to the terrible tragedy. Mary Ford's case was closed. Angela Clark, as always, did her job well, uncovering the complex connections and motives hidden behind the facade of ordinary life. But this investigation had left her with an unpleasant residue. She knew that sometimes the darkest and most frightening motives lurked behind the most ordinary and familiar things: jealousy, fear, and the desire to preserve what had long since been destroyed.